short. Thank you very much, Pat and Beth Ann, and thanks to the Mari Foundation for inviting me. I also didn't have to travel very far. MRB4 is actually closer than MRB3. So my task today is to talk to you about metals in ASD, and the next slide has some of the things that I'll be mentioning. Vaccines were already mentioned this morning, and what I'll do in the first part of my talk is try to point out to you about some of the differences between methyl mercury and ethyl mercury. The first one, which is derived primarily from fish, and the second one, ethyl mercury, being the compound that has been used in vaccines as a preservative. I'll talk about some other metals in ASD where there isn't very much literature about. And then, rather than talk to you individually about some of the deficiencies in each of the studies, what I did is I put together a few studies at the end to talk about some of the considerations, deficiencies, and what kinds of research needs need to be done in the future. And if I have time, I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we have done looking at polymorphisms in metal handling genes and autism. So Craig actually did a nice introduction this morning on the different types of epidemiological studies, and I don't have to talk very much about it. This is a slide that comes from a publication by Susan Parker in 2004 that shows those studies that have been conducted until that date, looking at the relationship between vaccines containing thimerosal and autistic spectrum disorder. And as you can see in the analysis years of the study, sort of in the middle, some of these are retrospective studies, some of them are ecological studies. There's, from the 8 or 9 studies that are here, most have not shown any association between the use of thimerosal and autism. The only series of studies are the ones in the middle that have been conducted in the USA by a father and son combination. And I'm not going to go into all the studies and the deficiencies in them or the strength of the studies. I think you can come up with both in each of these cases. But I'll mention that in the case of the VAERS study, which is the Geyer and Geyer study, that in these studies, the reporting is probably more biased than in the other studies because it's based on self-reporting. Everybody who suspects that he or she have a child with autism or any other developmental disorder can pick up the phone and call in. There's no verification by a neurologist, unlike the other types of studies that are listed here. As I said, all these studies have their problems, but probably the best one in terms of refuting a connection between thimerosal and autism is the one that was conducted in Denmark, which is at the bottom, where thimerosal has been removed from vaccines many years ago, and the frequency or the rate of autism in the Danish population has increased even after the removal of thimerosal from the vaccines. Now, there have been a few studies since then, and I'll discuss these very briefly. These are 2 studies that have been conducted by Susan Parker. They've been conducted in the United Kingdom, and as mentioned here, neither of these 2 studies have found that there is a relationship between thimerosal exposure and autism. There's a new study that came out in 2007, Thompson et al., which also found no evidence of neurologic problems in children exposed to mercury-containing vaccines or immune globulins. Now, this is a study that enrolled over 1,000 children between the ages of 7 and 10. The exposure to mercury was determined by computerized immunization records, talking with the parents, getting medical and personal immunization records, and association between current neuropsychological performance and exposure to mercury was assessed during the prenatal period, the neonatal period from birth to 28 days, and the first 7 months of life. I should mention that this study was not designed actually to look specifically at the rate of autism. It was just a general study to look at behavioral cognitive function in these children. And what these researchers have done is to look at 42 different neuropsychological outcomes There were some positive changes, there were some negative changes that were associated with the mercury exposure. They were not unidirectional, that is, in some cases the mercury was shown to be somewhat beneficial, in other cases it was shown to be detrimental. So for example, higher prenatal mercury exposure was associated with better performance on one measure of language, and it was associated with a poor performance on one measure of attention and executive functioning. Increasing mercury exposure from birth to 28 days was associated with poorer performance on one measure of speech articulation and a better performance on one measure of fine motor coordination. Again, so there's no concordance between these deficits and the amount of mercury that the children were exposed to. So the conclusion from this study was, and again, this is not specific for autism, that the study did not support a causal relationship or association between early exposure to mercury from thimerosal cell-containing vaccines and immune globulins and deficits in neuropsychological functioning between the age of 7 and 10 years. There have been some other studies. This is a study by Schechter and Grether that has been published this year, where they have looked at time trends in the prevalence by age and birth cohort of children with autism between 1995 to 2007. And the estimated prevalence in children between the age of 3 and 5 years with autism increased all the way, when one looks at it quarterly, from 1995 through 2007. Now, I should mention that in the United States, thimerosal has been removed in 2001. So again, if there was an association, one would have expected to see a decline between 2001 and 2007, and that does not seem to be the case. Now, I didn't say very much about thimerosal up to this point, but it has been used as a preservative in vaccines. It started in the 30s. The infants that receive the immunizations at a timely fashion would receive over the first 6 months of their life approximately 0.1 microgram of mercury per kilogram per day. And I think a lot of the concern, and justifiably so, with thimerosal has been the fact that it does exceed the reference dose, but the reference dose is actually not one that has been established for ethyl mercury, but it's one that has been established for methyl mercury. And what I hope to do in the next few slides is to show you that in terms of the pharmacokinetics of methyl mercury and ethyl mercury, there are great differences between the two compounds. So, as I said, the EPA guidelines are based on studies of exposure to methyl mercury, and unfortunately we have a number of epidemics that have occurred in Japan. There's actually a disease that's associated with exposure to methyl mercury, which is known as Minamata disease. There have been some epidemics in other countries, Guatemala, in Iraq, and the RFD for mercury is based on those studies, not ethyl mercury. Now, there's clearly similarities between methyl mercury and ethyl mercury. The only difference is that the ethyl mercury has an extra methyl chain compared to the methyl mercury. Structurally, they're very similar, and there are a lot of similarities in terms of their distribution, many similarities in terms of uptake mechanisms by which methyl mercury and ethyl mercury can cross the blood-brain barrier. So in some sense, it does make sense to do those analogies, but one needs to be very cautious in extrapolating from the ethyl mercury literature to and assume that it behaves very similarly or in a similar fashion to the methyl mercury. So what are the things that we know about ethyl mercury? We know that it decomposes much faster than methyl mercury, and I'll show you some slides from work by Tom Burbacher at the University of Washington in Seattle. We know that it's actually transported the same way as methyl mercury is on a large neutral amino acid transporter, which is known as LAT1. Mercury clears much faster after the administration of ethyl mercury versus methyl mercury, and I'll show you the half-lives for the two. Because the metabolic rates are related to the fractional power of the body weight, there are differences in terms of the clearance of mercury, and children will tend to clear it actually much faster compared to the adults. And the conclusions are essentially that blood mercury concentrations for methylmercury underestimate the safe exposure range for ethyl mercury, coming back to the fact that you cannot look at ethyl mercury and say an orange is an apple. So methylmercury is not a suitable reference for risk assessment from exposure to thimerosal-derived mercury, and that obviously means that a lot more needs to be done with thimerosal and ethyl mercury so we can get safe exposure levels. Now this is a slide from Tom Burbacher's work that was published in 2005 in Environmental Health Perspectives, where they've dosed monkeys with methylmercury and ethyl mercury, trying to mimic the vaccine regimen that children would undergo if they were vaccinated at the right time. And essentially they did, as I said, they used the monkeys to dose them both with methylmercury and with ethyl mercury. One was by oral doses in the case of methylmercury, and the other one, ethyl mercury, was by doing intramuscular injection. And what you can see here is the blood total mercury accumulation after a methylmercury injection, both the predicted and the observed, and you can see they're very good correlation between the two. But essentially what it shows you is that if you vaccinate the monkeys on a weekly basis, is that after the methylmercury exposure, the blood levels will not return to the baseline. So every time that the monkey gets another injection of methylmercury, the levels of mercury in the blood tend to increase. And this is what you see with ethyl mercury or thimerosal, which means that within 1 week, the levels of mercury in the blood pretty much turn to the basal levels. So the half-life or the clearance of mercury when it's administered as ethyl mercury is much, much faster compared to the clearance of methylmercury. You don't get this additive effect that I've shown you in the previous slide. Now this is a slide that shows the washout of total mercury in the blood and in the brain. So to your left, you have concentrations of mercury. A is after methylmercury exposure, and B to your right is after ethyl mercury exposure. And the dark line is the accumulation of mercury in the brain, or the dark boxes, I should say. The open circles at the bottom in A show the blood levels, and that's for methylmercury. And on the right-hand side, again, the dark or the closed boxes would be brain mercury accumulation, and the open ones would be the blood. What you should note is that A and B actually have different y-axes. In the case of A, these are both logarithmic. You can see that the concentrations are much higher. So, as you would expect, after methylmercury, the concentrations of mercury in the brain are much, much higher. And what's important to note, actually, is the slope of these lines. The line for the methylmercury is much more horizontal compared to the line that you see with the ethyl mercury. And that simply means that methylmercury is retained much, much longer, both in the brain and in the blood, as I've shown you in the previous slide. For ethyl mercury, the line is very steep. You could see it especially in the bottom. The half-life of mercury in the blood is about 8.9 days. For methylmercury, it's about 19 days. The half-life of methylmercury in the brain is about 60 days, and for ethyl mercury, it's 24 days. So again, these two compounds are not identical. This is the washout of organic and inorganic mercury. So when methylmercury gets into the brain, when ethyl mercury gets into the brain, over time it's actually demethylated or deethylated. So the organic mercury is converted to the inorganic species. And what you're looking at here is the amount of inorganic mercury in the brain after methylmercury administration and ethyl mercury administration. And again, you could see that there are differences in terms of the slope of the lines. These y-axes, again, are very different, but what's interesting actually is that after administration of ethyl mercury, there's more inorganic mercury in the brain compared to the methylmercury, and that has led some people to suggest that perhaps it's the inorganic mercury which is the damaging species. And we can talk about it later. I'm not going to address it here. But again, the half-life is very different. You could see from the slopes of these lines, methylmercury tends to stick along much, much longer compared to the ethyl mercury. It's been also done in in human babies very recently. This is a paper that was published in Pediatrics in 2008 from a group in Rochester, Pekikaro et al. And what they have done is to look at blood mercury levels before and after the vaccinations that contain thimerosal. They've done it in newborn infants on the top, 2-month-old infants, and 6-month-old infants. And the purpose of this slide is to show that with age, actually, there's no difference in terms of how the methyl mercury, or the ethyl mercury is being handled. You see there's a very rapid rise in the concentrations of mercury, nanograms per milliliter. These are the concentrations. And within about 3 to 4 days, 3.7 days, the level of mercury in the blood come back to basal level, those levels before the immunization. So it's very consistent with what I've shown you before in the monkeys. Now, there have been a number of other studies on mercury and autism, and I won't be able to summarize everything, but I thought I'd sort of summarize the ones that have been mostly discussed. And the point of the next few slides actually is just to show you that you can find some studies where mercury levels in autistic kids are elevated. You'll find some studies where levels of mercury in autistic kids are low. And when I get towards the end of my discussion, I'll point out some issues that need to be considered in these types of studies. So this is a study, a very recent study as well, by Adams et al. That was published last year, where they've looked at mercury and a number of other metals, zinc and lead, in baby teeth of children with autistic spectrum disorder. And the children with autism had significantly higher levels of mercury, but there were no differences in the levels of lead and no differences in the levels of zinc. The children with autism had significantly higher usage of oral antibiotics. And this is important because one of the ways that organic mercuries are being excreted from the body is by demethylation or deethylation that occurs in the gut. And what happens when kids are administered antibiotics is you wipe out, obviously, the flora in the gut, which is responsible for this demethylation or deethylation. And subsequently, it's not surprising that you tend to see higher levels of mercury. So it's questionable as to whether these increased concentrations of mercury in the blood are related, frankly, to the fact that these kids have autism, or whether it's secondary to the fact that these kids had much higher consumption of antibiotics. This is the same group, Kern et al., and actually opposing results. So in this case, they looked at the difference between some metals in the hair of 45 children with autism and matched controls. And I'll talk about actually matched controls and how valuable they are, because I don't think they are in most cases. What they found is that arsenic, cadmium, and lead were significantly lower in the hair of children with autism than in matched controls. And mercury was in the same direction. So in this case, the levels of mercury were lower. This is a study by Windham et al., also quite recent in 2006, that used data from the California autism surveillance system to look at just general air pollutants, not just mercury specifically. I focused just on metals and mercury. What they found, and this is in 284 children with autism and 657 control, they found that the compounds that contributed most to association between ASD included mercury, cadmium, and nickel. So in this case, there was a positive association between mercury and autism. This is another study from Kuwait, which was conducted in 40 boys with autism and 40 healthy boys, where they looked at accumulation of mercury in hair. And I should say hair is a very good biological media for mercury exposure, not so good for many other metals that don't have very high affinity for sulfhydryl groups. Mercury binds avidly to sulfhydryl groups or thiols, and nails and hair. For those of you who have hair, there's a lot of thiol groups there. So mercury can actually be scanned over time, and you can recreate a profile for exposure since we know precisely the rate at which the hair grows, which is about 1 centimeter a month. So this is in Kuwait, and again there was a significant association between hair concentrations of mercury, in this case lead, as well as uranium. There have been also a number of studies on mercury chelation, and the theories are actually abound. There was initially a suggestion that kids that have autism would have higher levels of mercury, and therefore upon chelation they would have more mercury in the urine, and then there were some theories actually that perhaps these kids cannot excrete mercury very efficiently, and therefore the concentrations of mercury in the urine would be reduced. This is a study by Bradstreet in 2003, where they've looked at 221 children with ASD and controls. They looked at post-chelation mercury concentration in the urine of autistic cases, and they found that the levels of mercury in the urine was about 3 times higher compared to the controls. Did I go the wrong way? No, this is a study by Holmes, which is also cited quite a bit in literature, from 2003. In this case, again, they looked at mercury levels in 94 children with autism and 45 age and gender matched controls. Within the autistic group, her mercury levels varied significantly across mildly, moderately, and severely autistic children. And hair mercury levels among controls were significantly correlated with a number of the mother's amalgams, or the fillings, the cavity fillings, and fish consumption. And this kind of relationship was absent for the kids that had autism. Now, some general considerations about all of these studies. First of all, urinary mercury excretion in autistic cases could reflect higher current exposure to mercury rather than increased tissue retention. There's, in my opinion, a lot of selection bias, because in most of these cases, the controls that are used in the chelation therapy studies and in hair studies and so forth are not really true controls. These kids are not randomly selected, but rather they're chosen from a population of children where the parents obviously have concern about the kids. So the kids may have been removed from a source of mercury, they may not be fed any fish, and that may actually account for those differences. I can tell you, for example, that in the Holmes study, if you look at the levels of mercury in the kids, the autistic kids, their hair concentrations actually were very similar to controls throughout the United States, and the controls in that study had mercury levels which are about 3-fold lower compared to controls everywhere else. So if you were to compare the autistic kids in the Holmes study with the other population at large, you would see no differences. Again, emphasizing that the kids who are coming in to be tested as controls under those conditions might not be a random sample of control children. In the Holmes study, also 46 of the mothers in the case group reported being treated for being Rh negative during pregnancy, receiving D immunoglobulins, and this is obviously a very high proportion versus the control group, which raises, again, issues about recall bias and some other concerns about the validity of the controls. In the case of chelation studies, we usually, or we don't actually, we don't have chelation or pre-chelation levels of mercury. So the kids are chelated, one measures mercury levels, but we don't know the levels before the chelation. There's no information on past mercury exposure in either the cases or the controls. It's not very easy also to measure mercury levels. Is this yellow? How long has it been on? 5 minutes? Okay, so I better rush. I was going to say, I think, and again, this probably shows my lack of knowledge in epidemiology, but the types of studies that have been done to date are related to vaccinations, where you divide the children to autistic and non-autistic, and then you look at the frequency of those kids in terms of how many of them were vaccinated or not. The type of study, in my opinion, that needs to be done is shown at the bottom, where you take the autistic kids and you ask a question about how many of these kids were vaccinated and how many of them were not. And I said it's not feasible. It's probably feasible. It's just a very hard study to do because the prevalence is relatively low. It's certainly going up. And the rates of unvaccinated kids is also very low, so it's going to be very hard to find a sample of children. Let me spend 1.5 minutes on the study that we have done. And the basis hypothesis is to test whether what we call metal handling genes, whether there are differences in polymorphisms in several genes that are known to be associated with the shuttling and responses to metals in the body between autistic kids and non-autistic kids. And the premise was that even under the conditions where there's really no change in the body burden of mercury, maybe because there are some SNPs or some polymorphisms in those genes, might it be possible that because the mercury is not compartmentalized into the right compartment, that we would see differences in the frequency, or we would see an association between those changes in those genes and the frequency of autism in the population? So the 4 genes that we looked at are LAT1, DMT1, MTF1, and MT1A. I'm not going to go through them, and I'm not going to go through the methodology, but just in summary, I would say that what Sarah Owens, who's in the audience here, has discovered was 64 polymorphisms, 27 of them were novel. As I said, these are the 4 genes that we looked at, and the frequency of these SNPs between the autistic population and the control population do not differ. This is a very small sample size, and we're now using TACMan to look at a much larger sample size, and the preliminary data that we have established that there is no difference in any of those genes. And I'll stop here. The last part of the work was done by Sarah Owens. She has a poster, and I encourage you to visit later. And this work was also done with help from our collaborators, Marshall Summer, Jonathan Haynes, and Kelly Rickman. And thank you for your attention, and sorry for being a little bit late.